Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loving Out Loud, Learning to Love in a Hate-Filled World, the video series. You've made it to Chapter 5. The title of this chapter is Delores, a term paper and washed feet. This is one of my favorite stories in the whole book. I've got some that I like, some that I wish I didn't remember as well as I do, and then there's this one. I enjoy this story of Delores, so I hope you enjoy it as well. Our theme scripture this week is Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Galatians 6:2 says, "Carry each other's burdens, and that this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." We can read that passage, and it talks about carrying each other's burdens, and we kind of focus on that. What's that mean? What's it mean to carry those burdens? And we should consider that. But I want you to think about, what does it mean to fulfill the law of Christ? What exactly is he talking about there? Which takes me to the second theme scripture this week. John 13:34 says, "A new command I give you." Jesus speaking. "A new command I give you, love one another." Oh, wait a minute. Isn't the greatest commandment to love your neighbor as yourself? So what's new about this? So he says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you." Aha, as I have loved you. So you must love one another. When he says, "as I have loved you," what did he mean by that? What exactly did he mean? I think he's referring back to the earlier part of John 13, where he washed the disciples' feet. Let me read that for you. It says, I'm going to start in verse 2. "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Jesus replied, 'You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand.' 'No,' said Peter, 'you shall never wash my feet.' Jesus answered, 'Unless I wash you, you have no part with me.' 'Then, Lord,' Simon Peter replied, 'not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well.' Jesus answered, 'Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you're clean, though not every one of you.' For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. 'Do you understand what I have done for you?' he asked them. 'You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you.'" And then in verse 34 he says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Now, I want to tell you a story of a Devo that I did. This is back in the early 2000s, so it was probably around 2007 or 8, probably 2008. I was asked to do a teen Devo at church camp. And so I'm there, and there's a bunch of teens, boys and girls, and we all gathered in this room to do this devotional. And I had them sit in a big circle. And then I had them number off 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, all the way around the room. And now keep in mind, sitting in the middle of the room, in the middle of the circle, was a pail of water and some rags, much as you see the picture there on the left. I had them number off 1, 2, 1, 2, and then I said, "Okay, I want all of the ones to take your shoes and socks off, and turn to John chapter 13." Now, as I progressed in this discussion and I progressed in the reading of this passage, I'm pretty sure that it got kind of uncomfortable in the circle, because I'm pretty sure that the people who had taken their shoes off thought, those were the number ones, thought that the number twos were going to be washing their feet. And the number twos thought, oh no, I've got to get down and wash somebody's feet. Now this is a pretty uncomfortable thing. I want you to think about it. Washing someone's feet is kind of an invasion of personal space, a little bit gross. And keep in mind also, not everybody in this circle knew everybody well that they were sitting next to. So in this concept, it was potentially someone who didn't know the person whose feet they were washing or who were washing their feet. So it was kind of an uncomfortable situation. And so I walked right up to it. I walked right up to the edge, right where you would say, okay, those of you who are number two, get down, get a wet rag, wash the foot of the person to your right. I got right up to that, and then I stepped away. And the reason I did is because foot washing is a voluntary thing. It's not something you do out of compulsion. It's not something that you do because you're guilted into it. It's a voluntary choice, a free will offering, where you give yourself to someone else. You're sacrificing of yourself to take care of the other person, much as Jesus sacrificed himself. He was Lord. He was master. He was a rabbi. It was inconceivable that a rabbi would disrobe and wash the feet of those who were his followers. Inconceivable. Total ability to humiliate himself for the sake of those he loved. He set that example, and it's a voluntary thing. Now we're going to move on to talk a little bit about Delores. You can see the picture of Delores there to the left. Dolores was, well, back then we call them church secretaries. I think today they're probably church administrators. But she was a church secretary. She had a little tiny office off the old, what we called the old auditorium. It was a little tiny room, and it had a window that overlooked the sidewalk that walked up to the front doors. But basically, it was a cramped space. And this is where she did the bulletins. This is where she wrote letters for the church. This is where she kept attendance stuff, all the little details that the church administrators did in those days. And it was dominated in the middle of the room with this giganto typewriter, which we'll get to in a moment. But that's Delores on the left. On the right is me about the time of this story. So this is my senior picture. I was taking college prep classes. And at the particular time of this story, I was in the middle of a term paper class. So in addition to taking harder math classes and harder science classes, one of the things they had me do was to take a class to teach me how to create a term paper, which involved, learning to build the theme, do the research, do the footnotes, do the bibliography. And it culminated with what became my dilemma. So my dilemma was it required a 10-page typed term paper to be turned in at the end of the period. That term paper had to be double spaced. It had to be the margins had to be set at a certain spacing, and it had to include the footnotes. It had to include the bibliography. The bibliography was not part of the 10 pages. So basically, it was probably 11 or 12 pages plus the cover. So this was due at the end of the class. I guess it was a 9-week class. And I knew from the beginning of the 9 weeks that this term paper was due. So what I'm about to tell you and confess to you is that I was a massive procrastinator. Sometimes I'm still a procrastinator, and one of these days I'll get around to dealing with that. But that's me on the right as a senior at about the time that this story took place. So I came to Delores with a dilemma. You see, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon the day before the term paper was due to be turned in. And I did not yet have any idea how and where I was going to get it typed. Because you see, I didn't know how to type. And I didn't have a typewriter. And I didn't have access to a typewriter. And the only typewriter I knew of where I had the chance of having access was at the church office, Delores' office. And so I was very involved in my church. They were very good to me, the Fairlawn Church in Muncie. I had a key to the building. I didn't need it in this case because Delores was in her office, but I had a key to the building. I had a lot of respect among the church, even as a senior in high school. But I didn't know how to type, and the only access I had was the church typewriter, which turned out to be an electric typewriter. It was about as big as a Volkswagen. It took up about a third of her office. Big silver gray thing with a little silver ball that jumped in the middle as you typed, and it had correction ribbon and the whole thing. And so I walk into Delores' office around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I say, "Hey, Delores, can I use the typewriter?" And she goes, "Well, hi, Mike. Do you know how to type?" I'm like, no, but I can figure it out. And she just kind of looked at me. It's like, well, I figured I could figure it out because, I was a pretty bright kid. I figured out stuff all the time. And I figured I could, at the worst case scenario, I could hunt and peck and get through 10 pages. I had no clue about how to set up the margins, how to make it do double space, how to do corrections when I hit the wrong key. I didn't understand any of that, but I figured I'd figure it out. And so I wasn't asking her to do anything other than let me use the typewriter. And that was, folks, my dilemma. Now I got to tell you guys, she looked at me and she's like, "Do you know how to type?" And that was bad enough. And then she said, "Have you ever used an electric typewriter?" I think, folks, about that time, I was about to cry. Because you see, if I didn't turn in the term paper, that was going to mean an F in term paper class. And the thing you got to understand about me, in my entire school career, the lowest grade I'd ever gotten was 1D in a shop class in middle school. Everything else had been B's, A's and B's mostly, with a handful of C's. I'd never flunked a class. I was all the way to my senior year, and I didn't have any intention of flunking a class up to that point. And so one way or another, I had to figure out how to get this typed. And if that meant I sat up all night hunting and pecking on a typewriter I didn't know how to use, I was going to do it. So, "Do you know how to type?" she asked. And then, "Have you ever even used an electric typewriter?" And I had to confess, no, I didn't. Now you see that typewriter there in the picture. Hers was even bigger than that one. Much bigger with the little silver ball. And I said, "I'll figure it out." And Delores looked up at me and she said, "I'll type it for you." I'm like, "What?" She's like, "I'll type it for you." Oh my goodness, you would not believe the sense of relief that came over me. She was going to type my term paper for me. It was unbelievable. Now I got to tell you, she didn't have to do that. Galatians chapter 6 verse 10 says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let's do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Delores did good for me. She did good to me. Now think about it. I created this scenario. I had known for 9 or 10 weeks that this term paper was due, and I had not arranged anyone to type it for me all the way up to less than 24 hours before it was due. I hadn't approached anyone. I really had no idea who to approach. I had made myself, I had backed myself into a corner. I had created a scenario, and basically I was going to have to sleep in the bed that I made. She could have said no. That's what she could have done. She could have looked at this little high school kid and said no. She could have told me that the typewriter was too expensive for me to use. So, it was too expensive of a piece of machinery, and it wouldn't be right for her to let someone who with no experience play around with it. And she could have sent me packing. She could have sent me home without any help. And then she could have gone off and done whatever it was she was going to do that night. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure she had plans. It was late in the afternoon. But instead, she had pity on me. She looked at me and she loved me, and she volunteered her time. She took my burden onto her own shoulders, and she rescued me despite my procrastination. Now you think about that. Sometimes we as people, we look at people who need help in the world and we think, well, it's your fault you're in that situation. You've created your own problem, so go fix it. But that's not what Delores did. She took my burden onto her shoulders despite the fact that I had created it myself. And then she spent literally 6 hours typing my term paper. I walked out of the church building following Delores and locked the door after 10 o'clock that night. 6 hours of typing, of corrections, of thrown away pieces of paper, of all of the different things that go into creating the term paper. She did it. It took 6 hours out of her life, but those 6 hours made a huge difference in my life. Now you say, well, Delores must have been very close to you. She must have been someone who was a really great friend. Well, she is now. At the time, we knew each other. She knew who I was, but it's not like we spent any time together. I'd never been to her house. She'd never been to my house. We had never done anything more than just speak in passing at church. And yet she was willing to give of herself and make a difference in my life. And here we are. I was 18 at the time. Now I'm approaching 60. And for 40 plus years, this has been something that has been truly something touched my life, touched my heart. Because Delores, you see, she fulfilled that law of Christ. She washed my feet that day. She sacrificed herself for the sake of my need, and she washed my feet. That's what Delores did. Okay, folks, here's your discussion questions for this particular week. Again, pause them in between and discuss them. Hopefully, if you're in a group, you can banter them back and forth a little bit. If you're all alone, then pause them long enough to think about each one. Don't just gloss over the discussion questions. Number 1, have you ever found yourself in the midst or the middle of a problem that you could not handle on your own? We like to think of ourselves in this country as being self-sufficient, being people that we can solve all of our own problems, but the reality is that all of us have situations that we can't handle on our own. Share about those with each other. Number 2, share about a time when someone went out of their way to help you. someone changed their schedule, sacrificed a day, sacrificed some hours, sacrificed whatever in order to help you. Share about a time. Number 3, how does it make you feel when someone sacrifices to help you in your time of need? How do you feel when someone does that for you? Number 4, have you ever had someone refuse to help you when you really needed it? How did that feel? And number 5, explain how carrying someone else's burden fulfills the law of Christ. Talk about that topic a little bit. Now I think it's time for our challenge of the week. The weekly challenge. This week, look for an opportunity to go out of your way to sacrifice personal plans, your time, or your resources to help someone in need. See what difference you can make in someone else's life by carrying their burdens and washing their feet this week. Next week, we get to talk about a story that burdened me, bothered me, rode with me for about 30 years. We get to talk about Jimmy, bumblebees, and forgiveness. I hope that you have a good week, and thank you for taking the time to participate in this class.